Say it again. The part about forever.
Forever. With you, forever's easy.
What are you doing in here? This is a wedding, not a break room.
I was invited, same as you.
Men like you don't belong at tables like this. Go wait with the van.
Vivian, do you have any idea who you're talking to?
Vivian Marsh believed she could read a person within 10 seconds of meeting them. She believed wealth left fingerprints everywhere it touched, in the cut of a jacket, the brand of a watch, the way a person held eye contact when they shook your hand. On a humid morning in Charleston, South Carolina, she shook hands with a quiet man in a faded gray work jacket and decided, in less than 10 seconds, that he was not worth her attention. She had no idea that the man standing in front of her, holding the keys to a van she assumed he could barely afford to drive, had spent 15 years building something worth more than every name on her family's wedding guest list combined. By the time she learned the truth, she would have already said the words she could never take back. This is not really a story about money. It is a story about the price of looking at another human being and deciding, in an instant, exactly what they are worth. It is about a woman who measured people the way she had been taught to measure them, and a man who never once corrected her, because he wanted to see if she would figure it out on her own. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Why did Vivian say what she said in that parking lot, in front of people whose opinions she had spent her whole life trying to protect? What was Daniel Cole really doing behind the wheel of that van, when men with his kind of money usually never touch a steering wheel at all? And when the truth finally caught up with both of them, would there be enough left between them to repair? Stay with us, because by the end of this story, you may find yourself asking who the wealthy one in this story really was. Vivian was 34 years old and had spent the last decade trying to become a different version of herself than the one she started out as. Her father, Harold Marsh, had run a small catering business out of a rented kitchen for 20 years before he passed away from a heart attack 2 summers ago, leaving Vivian's mother, Carol, to take over an operation that was always one bad month away from closing its doors. Vivian had grown up watching her father count quarters at the end of long event nights, and she had promised herself, somewhere around age 12, that she would never again feel the particular shame of being looked down on for not having enough. That promise had calcified into something harder over the years. It had become a habit of looking down on others first, before they had the chance to do it to her. 3 years earlier, Vivian had been engaged to a man named Connor Whitfield, the son of a real estate developer whose name was stitched into half the buildings in downtown Charleston. The engagement ended 2 months before the wedding, when Connor admitted, almost casually, that his family had never fully accepted a woman whose mother still worked events for a living. "It's not that they dislike you," he had said, looking somewhere past her shoulder instead of at her face. "They just always pictured someone a little more, established." Vivian had cried for one night and then decided, with the same calcified certainty she applied to everything, that she would never again be caught on the wrong side of that line. She started dressing differently, speaking differently, correcting her mother's grammar at dinner. She told herself it was ambition. It was, more honestly, armor. Daniel Cole had a different story, though no one at that wedding would have guessed it by looking at him. He grew up in Allendale, a small town 2 hours inland, where his mother cleaned office buildings at night and his father drove a delivery truck for a regional produce company. At 19, Daniel took a job driving that same delivery route after his father's knees gave out, and he kept driving it for 6 years, learning every back road, every loading dock, every shipping manager's name between Charleston and Augusta. He was not chasing wealth. He was chasing reliability, the one thing his family had never had enough of. He saved almost everything he made and bought his first used box truck at 25. By the time he turned 34, the same age as Vivian, Daniel owned Cole Freight and Logistics, a regional trucking and refrigerated transport company with 41 vehicles and 93 employees, most of them hired directly out of the same small towns he had grown up in. He had built it slowly, contract by contract, without ever taking on outside investors, because he did not trust anyone who had not seen the inside of a loading dock at 4 in the morning. He still drove a route himself at least once a month, not because he had to, but because he believed the man who stopped doing the work eventually stopped understanding the people who did it. That belief was the reason he was behind the wheel of a rented passenger van on the morning he met Vivian Marsh. The wedding belonged to Vivian's cousin, Natalie, and it was being held at a vineyard 40 minutes outside the city, the kind of venue with string lights and a 5-figure flower budget. Carol Marsh's catering company had been hired to handle the food, and Vivian, now her mother's head of business development, had taken charge of every logistical detail, partly out of competence and partly because Connor's extended family, including his mother, had been invited as old family friends of the bride's side. Vivian needed everything to look effortless. 2 days before the wedding, the transportation company hired to shuttle out-of-town guests from the airport called to say their regular driver had a family emergency. The agency sent a replacement. His name, according to the contract, was the co. Daniel arrived 40 minutes early in a clean but unremarkable grey work jacket, the kind he had worn on delivery routes for 15 years and never bothered to replace. He introduced himself to Vivian with a handshake and a calm, even voice, and she barely looked up from her clipboard. She told him, without looking him in the eye, where to park and which guests to prioritize, speaking the way she might speak to a piece of furniture that happened to be able to follow instructions. Daniel said, "Yes, ma'am," and nothing else. He had been spoken to that way before, by people who assumed a grey jacket meant a small life, and he had learned, a long time ago, that arguing rarely changed a closed mind. He simply did the job well. For the first half of the wedding day, Daniel was nearly invisible in the way good help is trained to be invisible. He shuttled 6 carloads of relatives from the airport without a single complaint, helped an elderly guest with a cane into the van without being asked, and quietly noticed when the refrigerated truck carrying the wedding cake started running 10 minutes behind schedule because of a flat tire on the highway. While Carol Marsh panicked in the kitchen tent, Daniel made one phone call to a dispatcher he trusted, rerouted a spare delivery vehicle from his own company that happened to be 20 minutes away, and had the cake on site before anyone outside the kitchen tent even knew there had been a problem. He did not mention it to Vivian. He simply went back to parking cars. It was at the rehearsal dinner that everything started to change. Daniel, technically off the clock for the evening but still on site in case anyone needed a ride back to their hotel, found himself standing near the bar talking with one of Natalie's uncles, a man named Robert who turned out to have grown up 2 towns over from Allendale. The conversation was easy and warm, the kind 2 strangers fall into when they realize they share a hometown accent. Robert laughed loudly at something Daniel said, and several guests, including Connor's mother, turned to see what the laughter was about. Vivian, crossing the room with a tray of sitting cards, saw the driver in the grey jacket comfortably chatting with her ex-fiancé's mother, and something old and humiliated rose up in her chest before she even understood why. She crossed the room quickly, pulled Daniel a few steps away by the elbow, and said, low enough that she thought no one else would hear, "You were hired to drive, not to mingle with my family's guests. People like you don't get to sit at this table, even for 5 minutes, so I'd appreciate it if you remembered your place for the rest of the night." Robert had followed 2 steps behind, close enough to hear every word. Daniel's face did not change. He said, "Understood, ma'am," nodded once, and walked back toward the parking lot. And that was the moment, though Vivian would not understand it for another 6 weeks, when she said the words she would spend the rest of this story trying to take back. Daniel drove the rented van back to the depot that night without turning on the radio, the way he usually did when something needed quiet to settle. His foreman, a man named Marcus who had worked beside him since the box truck days, was waiting in the lot when he pulled in and asked why he looked like he had been somewhere he did not want to be. Daniel told him what happened, word for word, without anger in his voice, the same way he might describe a flat tire or a late shipment. Marcus asked if he wanted to tell her who she had actually been talking to. Daniel shook his head. He said that if a person needed to know your worth before they could treat you with basic decency, then telling them only proved their point, not yours. He went home, slept, and showed up to work the next morning the same way he always did. If you have ever caught yourself saying something cruel in a moment of panic, something that had nothing to do with the person in front of you and everything to do with an old wound you never finished healing, let us know in the comments. Has there ever been a moment you wish you could take back the second the words left your mouth? Keep watching, because Vivian's moment was about to come back to her in a way she never saw coming. Robert did not say anything that night, but he remembered. 3 weeks after the wedding, Carol Marsh's catering company received devastating news. Their refrigerated transport contractor, the company that handled every cold chain delivery for events across 3 counties, announced a sudden 40% rate increase, citing rising fuel and insurance costs. For a small catering business already operating on thin margins, the increase was close to a death sentence. Kara called every transport company in the region looking for a better rate, and most quoted prices even higher than the one they already had. Vivian, desperate to find a solution before her mother had to start turning down bookings, kept hearing the same name mentioned by other vendors as the most reliable and fairly priced option left in the region: coal freight and logistics. Carol Marsh sat at the kitchen table one night that week with the company's bank statement spread out in front of her, the same kitchen table where Harold used to count his quarters, and told Vivian, quietly, that she did not know how many more months they could absorb a 40% increase before she had to let staff go. Vivian watched her mother's hands shake slightly as she added the numbers a third time, and she thought about how easily her mother had built a life out of nothing twice, once with Harold and once alone, and how unfair it felt that the world kept asking her to do it a third time. Vivian promised her mother she would find a solution before the month was out, even though she had no idea yet where it would come from. Vivian did not connect the name to anything. She had never bothered to learn the last name of the man in the grey jacket, because she had never thought of him as a person worth remembering. She scheduled a meeting through Coal Freight's general business line, prepared a pitch about long-term partnership rates, and drove to their headquarters on the outskirts of the city 6 weeks after the wedding, wearing her shopper's blazer, ready to negotiate with whoever sat behind the desk. She rehearsed her opening line in the car. She had no idea that the man she was about to meet had spent the last 6 weeks quietly proving, through 93 employees and 41 trucks, exactly the kind of life he had built without ever needing her approval to do it. The lobby of Coal Freight and Logistics was simple but unmistakably solid, the kind of building owned outright rather than leased. A framed local business award hung near the front desk, dated 2 years earlier, with a photograph of a man shaking hands with the Regional Chamber of Commerce president. Vivian glanced at it on her way to the conference room and felt something tighten in her stomach before her brain had fully caught up with her eyes. The man in the photograph was wearing a suit instead of a grey jacket, but the face was unmistakable. She was still staring at the frame when the conference room door opened and Daniel Cole walked in, dressed simply, calm as he had been in the parking lot, extending the same steady handshake he had offered her 6 weeks earlier. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Vivian did not know what to say. She sat through 20 minutes of a business meeting in which Daniel spoke with the same even, professional tone he had used as a driver, never once mentioning the wedding, never once bringing up the parking lot. He listened to her pitch, asked sharp and fair questions about her mother's business, and ultimately offered Carol Marsh's company a long-term contract at a rate lower than anyone else in the region had quoted, simply because, he said, he remembered what it was like to run a business on thin margins. He never raised his voice. He never mentioned what she had said to him. The silence about it was somehow louder than if he had. Vivian drove home that afternoon and sat in her car outside her apartment for 40 minutes without going inside. She thought about the grey jacket, about Robert's face when she pulled Daniel aside, about the phrase, "people like you," leaving her own mouth as easily as ordering coffee. She thought about her father counting quarters at midnight, about Connor's mother's voice the night the engagement ended, about every moment in the last 3 years she had used as an excuse to decide what someone else deserved before she had bothered to learn a single true thing about them. She had spent years protecting herself from ever being looked down on again, and in doing exactly that, she had looked down on a man who had built more, with less, than anyone she had ever dated, married, or planned a wedding for. 2 weeks later, Vivian asked her mother for Daniel's direct number, telling herself it was about contract details. She called him on a Thursday evening and, before he could say more than hello, she said she needed to apologize, properly, in person, for what she had said to him at the rehearsal dinner. There was a long pause on the line. Daniel finally said he would meet her, not because he needed the apology, but because he was curious whether she had actually figured out what she had gotten wrong. They met at a diner near his headquarters, the kind of place with vinyl booths and coffee that never stopped refilling. Vivian apologized without excuses, without mentioning her own father or her own old wounds as justification, simply admitting that she had been cruel to a stranger because of an assumption she had never bothered to check. Daniel listened without interrupting, the same way he had listened during contract negotiations, and when she finished, he told her something she had not expected. He said the comment had not surprised him, because he had heard versions of it his whole life, from people who saw a grey jacket and assumed it meant a small future. What had actually stayed with him, he said, was not her cruelty but her silence afterward, the way she had walked away without a flicker of doubt on her face, as if the words had cost her nothing at all. He told her the apology mattered, but it mattered more that she seemed to understand, now, that the cost had never been his to pay. It had always been hers, whether she paid attention to it or not. They did not fall into a sudden romance, and this story will not pretend they did, because real change rarely moves that fast. Over the following months, Vivian and Daniel crossed paths occasionally through the business partnership between their families' companies, and slowly, carefully, something like genuine respect grew where there had once been a one-sided assumption. Vivian changed the way she walked into rooms. She started asking people what they did before she decided what they were worth. She started speaking to her mother's kitchen staff the way she wished someone had spoken to her father all those years ago, counting quarters at midnight, never once asked about the dreams he had quietly given up to keep his daughter fed. One evening that fall, a young server named Tasha, hired only a few weeks earlier, knocked over a tray of glasses during a dinner setup and froze, waiting for the kind of scolding she had clearly received before at other jobs. Vivian knelt down, helped sweep up the glass herself, and told her it happened to everyone at least once, including her own mother, twice. Tasha laughed, relieved, and went back to work without the shame Vivian once would have let her carry for the rest of the night. It was a small moment, the kind no one else in the room even noticed, but Vivian noticed it in herself, and that was the part that mattered. A year after the wedding, Vivian Marsh's catering company was thriving again, no longer one bad month from closing, in part because of a fair contract from a company that remembered what team margins felt like. Vivian still saw Daniel from time to time, and the conversations between them had become easy in a way she had never expected, free of the old performance she used to bring into every interaction with anyone she thought might be useful to her. She had not earned a relationship out of her mistake. She had earned something smaller and more honest, the understanding that the grey jacket had never been the thing worth judging, and that the only person who had ever been small in that parking lot was the one who thought she had the right to decide it. What would you have done if you were standing in Vivian's place that night, surrounded by people whose opinions you had spent years trying to protect? And if you were Daniel, handed that kind of cruelty by a stranger who never bothered to learn your name, would you have walked away in silence, the way he did, or would you have said something back? We would really love to know how this story made you feel, and whether you have ever judged someone too quickly, only to regret it later. Tell us in the comments below. And if you think this story stayed with you, wait until you hear what happens in our next story, about a family that thought they had lost everything, until a stranger they once turned away from their door came back to return a debt no one even remembered was owed. Subscribe for more timeless stories that will touch your heart and keep you thinking long after the video ends.